Welcome to this episode of Talking Foreign Affairs with Adil Cader. Today, we are extremely honored to be joined by one of the most recognizable names, not just in foreign policy, but in general academia. Someone recognized as one of the most critically engaged public intellectuals. We would have all come across his work at some point in our lives, Professor Noam Chomsky. Today's episode will be a broad conversation on topical issues impacting global affairs, especially touching upon recent books and speeches released by Professor Chomsky. This includes topics on the global change post-pandemic, the climate crisis, and the future of internationalism. We would also like to thank our listeners who submitted in questions. We often hear this saying that this person needs no introduction. And if there was ever a time that it would be used, now would be it, as it is difficult to summarize Professor Chomsky's extensive career. However, we will try our best. Professor Noam Chomsky is an American theoretical linguist whose work from the 1950s revolutionized the field of linguistics. Known as the father of modern linguistics, through his contribution to related fields, including cognitive psychology and the philosophies of mind and language, Professor Chomsky helped to initiate and sustain what became known as the cognitive revolution. Relevant to this discussion, Professor Chomsky also gained a worldwide following as a political dissident for his analysis of foreign policy and intellectual culture. He is the most quoted author still alive and the writer of many award-winning books. Professor Chomsky is internationally recognized as one of the most critically engaged public intellectuals and continues to comment on foreign policy and global affairs. He has numerous honorary degrees and has held senior teaching positions at leading universities, including MIT and Oxford. His latest book talks about the need for a new global vision in light of the COVID pandemic. Even at the age of 93, Professor Chomsky continues to be generous with his time and active in commentary. Professor Chomsky, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Professor Chomsky, you have lived through some key moments in world history and written extensively on them. You've spoken about hearing speeches at the beginning of the Second World War, and you did recently state that we're approaching the most dangerous point in human history. Could you please explain why this is the case, especially compared to other conflicts and issues we've had in the 20th century?
Why President Trump was the most dangerous person in human history? Pretty obvious. We are facing an incredible crisis. We are destroying the environment that sustains life. You know that there are plenty of signs of it where you are, but it's basically beyond question. President Trump was committed to accelerating the race to destruction. He was committed to expanding without limit the use of the most dangerous fossil fuels and eliminating the regulatory apparatus, which to some extent mitigated the crisis. I mean, pulling out of the Paris Agreement was just a symbolic example. There can't be anything more dangerous than that. I mean, Hitler was an utter monster, but he wasn't trying to destroy the whole human species. Of course, I don't say that Trump is trying to do this. He probably doesn't care. He just cares about increasing the profits of the constituency that he slavishly serves, corporate sector, ultra-rich, and so on. If this increases their profits, who cares if the world goes down the tube?
And you speak also a lot in some of your recent speeches about a global vision, sort of a new world, a new way of doing things post-COVID. What are some of those ideas that you have?
Other approaches are to follow the recommendations of the IPCC, many detailed plans that have been developed, which show that we can, in fact, address the crisis of heating the climate, frying the world, with quite feasible measures that would, in fact, mean a fraction of the expenditures that are used to bail out the rich corporations from what they lose during the COVID crisis, 2 or 3% of GDP. It's all available. There are detailed plans. Now, in fact, we're going backwards. One of the major horrible consequences of Putin's invasion of Ukraine was that the much too limited efforts to deal with this existential crisis have been set into reverse. So, for example, take the United States, most important country, obviously. One day, the IPCC issues another dire warning that we must begin to reduce fossil fuels right now, no delay, certain percentage every year till we phase them out in a few decades. That's one day. The next day, President Biden announces vast new areas of federal lands being handed over to energy corporations to exploit for oil. Notice that this is pure political theater, has absolutely nothing to do with the problems of supplying fuel, has nothing to do with inflation, nothing. These poisons will not even come into line for several years. This is political theater, which has the effect of moving towards destruction of the conditions for organized human life. And what is missing is, okay, instead of moving on to destroy the environment more quickly for political gain, let's use the time available to move rapidly towards renewable energy in ways that are quite feasible and save ourselves and future generations. But that's not considered.
So are you still optimistic about the prospect of net zero by 2050? Is it too late?
There are plenty of people, mostly young people, who are working energetically and actively to try to prevent this disaster from happening. With enough support, they can succeed. They're not getting the support. When Greta Thunberg stands up at the Davos meeting and tells the millionaires there that you have betrayed us, she's right. Yes, my generation, later generations have betrayed the young. How do they react? Polite applause, patting her on the head and saying, nice little girl, why don't you go back to school? That's our leadership. In fact, sometimes it gets so grotesque, you can almost only laugh. You may have followed this about a week or two ago. One of the chief investment officials of one of the top investment firms gave a speech to investors in which he said, you don't have to worry about all this liberal nonsense about global warming. We're investors, we're realistic. We look a couple years ahead, and investing in fossil fuels is very good business for the next couple of weeks ahead. So forget all these tree huggers and crazy liberals and just invest in fossil fuels. Well, he received some criticism for that. But then the editors of the Wall Street Journal plunged in, leading business journal in the United States, and said, he is absolutely correct. All these people are criticizing him, don't understand anything. They don't believe in the market. And the market is telling us we should destroy the world as quickly as possible. So if you don't believe in the market, you're some kind of communist sympathizer. So of course he's right. That's what we're hearing. If you think I'm This is a parody. I urge you to read it. It's not a parody. This is what we're hearing at the highest level of business and policy formation. Right now, the meetings are going on in Davos, maybe the last couple of days. And there's a pretty good review of it by Rana Foroohar, editor of the Financial Times. She just makes fun of the vaporizing, all kind of nice talk about responsible investing. And then you go off to your jet planes, your fancy parties, and forget it all because you don't intend to do anything. Well, that's our leadership.
So you would agree that these bodies such as the World Economic Forum, what's happening in Davos, and the COP meetings for climate change, they need some sort of drastic restructure to actually address some of these concerns?
Well, take the latest meeting on climate change, Glasgow. There were actually two meetings going on. Only one got a lot of reporting. One was inside the stately halls where the rich and powerful were congratulating one another on the wonderful things they're going to do. Then there was another outside in the streets where tens of thousands of young people were demonstrating, pleading with the people who hold the masters of the world, pleading with them to do something instead of empty talk. That's the important meeting. In fact, if you look into it, it was interesting to see what happened. The American representative, John Kerry, was euphoric. He said, "We've won. We have the market on our side. The big investors have promised that they hold, $100 trillion of investments, and they're going to use them to deal with the climate crisis. So we've won. It's finished." There was a piece, an article by one of the top political economists, Adam Tooze, in which he went through this. And he said, yes, it's true. Larry Fink of BlackRock, big investor, informed the meeting that the investor community with whatever it is, $130 trillion, is now planning to devote themselves to dealing with climate change. But there was a footnote. The footnote is, we will invest as long as it is profitable. And if an investment doesn't work out, we insist that the International Monetary Fund bail us out. So we'll be happy to help if we can make money. And if something goes wrong, you, the taxpayer, will pay us for it. That's the great gift that the investment community is offering the world. So we've won. The market's on our side. That's inside the halls. Outside the halls, young people could see exactly what this is, a way to kick the ball down the road so they can keep making exorbitant profits, and what happens to the world doesn't matter.
And I'll actually tie that into one of the questions we got from our listeners is, what advice do you have for young people who feel their voice isn't being heard in global affairs, who aren't part of government or policy-making bodies? What advice would you give for their voices to be considered for policy proposals?
We are racing to a precipice. It'll be the end of organized human life, not in the distant future. Not everyone's not going to die tomorrow, but we will soon reach irreversible tipping points, after which there's a steady decline to a world that is totally unlivable. I mean, we're coming close to the point where South Asia, much of the Middle East and Africa, will literally be unlivable. I mean, temperatures in Pakistan and India are reaching close to 50 degrees Celsius. Well, I happen to live in the desert in Arizona, where temperatures go into the 40s. But this is a rich country. I have solar panels on the roof, air conditioning system. Okay, we can manage. Not if you're a peasant in Rajasthan or in Punjab, you're not going to survive. So what's going to, or in Bangladesh, what's going to happen to these tens of millions of people? This investor advisor who I quoted before started by saying, it doesn't matter if Miami is 6 feet underwater. We have the technology to keep going. What happens when Bangladesh is 6 feet underwater? A peasant up the coastal plains with tens of millions of people. Well, that's somebody else's problem. We just are worried about the rich and powerful. So what is the advice? We know what to do. We have the programs that can end this feasibly. So get to work and make sure that the gangsters who run the world are compelled to pursue these policies. That can be done. We don't live in totalitarian states. The stormtroopers aren't coming in to throw us both into the gulag for talking like this. Okay, that means we have a large measure of freedom. So let's use it.
Moving on to the situation in Eastern Europe, given the recent NATO expansions with members like Finland and Sweden joining, what do you think these impacts will be on the crisis?
Well, it's very interesting to watch. So take right now, Sweden and Finland are applying for membership in NATO. Sweden's a very interesting case. When it looked like the Nazis were going to rule the world, Sweden was neutral, was tilting towards the Nazis, helping them. But now there's a much more severe danger than the Nazis. Who is it? The Russians. And you take a look at Sweden and Finland. Actually, I've just had some interviews there talking about it. It's quite interesting. They have two ideas in mind. One idea is gloating over the fact that Putin has demonstrated that the Russian military is a paper tiger, totally incompetent, no leadership, can't function, can't even conquer cities a couple of kilometers from the border. So wonderful. They've demonstrated that they're nothing, just a paper tiger. That's one idea. Second idea, we have to cower in terror before this paper tiger and arm ourselves to the teeth because it's planning to take over the whole world. Well, George Orwell had a name for that. He called it doublethink, the capacity to have two contradictory ideas in mind and believe both of them. He thought that was a feature of hyper-totalitarian states, but it's in fact a feature of educated, liberal, democratic societies, which tells you something. You can't believe both of these ideas and be sane. What's happening is totally different. It has nothing to do with the security of Sweden and Finland. Both of them are advanced industrial states with substantial military systems, big military producers. There is not a slightest security concern, but there are other concerns. So, for example, Saab military industries in Sweden would love to have a bigger market for its military production. Same with Finland, major military producer itself. They're both more or less integrated into the NATO military command already, just a small step to formalize it. But if they do, terrific markets. And furthermore, you can drive these countries farther to the right, undermine what's left of their social democratic systems, move them into the more neoliberal form of anti-social democratic continental Europe. That's what's happening. It's pretty obvious. The security claim is absolutely zero. It's not even a joke. Now take Germany. Germany is now rapidly increasing its military production. With current plans, it will soon be the biggest military power on the continent, comparable in military power to Russia, not with nuclear weapons, but of course they're supplied by the United States, so it's no difference. Well, there are people like me who are old enough to have enough historical memory not to be too happy when they see Germany becoming the most powerful military force in the region. Well, is that something we might think about? Is Germany doing this for defense? What are the chances of Russia attacking Germany? I mean, it's more likely that Germany will be hit by an avalanche which will destroy the whole country. I mean, we're not even talking about the real world here.
So I know one of the other criticisms of the NATO expansion is that it might antagonize Russia. I know you've touched upon this previously in the past, is how in the 90s, the US program for the Partnership of Peace, and that being a potential alternative to NATO membership. Do you still think a similar program to the Partnership for Peace could be applied in this situation?
Yeah, it could. Partnership of Peace, which was the first George Bush administration, early Clinton years, was not very different from Gorbachev's proposal for the post-war, post-Soviet world. He called it a European common home with no military alliances. Well, the wording of you read Clinton's early speeches, 1993, 1994, he was developing the Partnership of Peace. It didn't eliminate NATO, but it marginalized it. It was to the side. You could be members of the Partner of Peace without being members of NATO. So Tajikistan joined. Actually, Russia could have joined, as they were trying to do. That was early 1990s. By the mid-1990s, Clinton was changing his tune. He was still telling his friend Yeltsin, don't worry, we're not going to go to your borders. But he was telling the ethnic communities in the United States, don't worry, your countries are going to join NATO. Polish community, vote for me, we'll bring you into NATO. Totally domestic political concerns. In fact, Clinton conceded this. You look at 1997, he had a discussion with NATO, with Yeltsin, it's been declassified, in which he says to his friend Boris, look, I just have to bring Poland into NATO or I'm not going to win the next election. But it doesn't mean anything. We're not going to do anything about it, so don't worry about it. Okay.
So how do you think this conflict will eventually end?
Well, as a matter of logic, there's two ways for a conflict to end. One is by a diplomatic settlement. The other is one side capitulates. There is no other way. So that's how it'll end. Is Russia going to capitulate? Well, not very likely. What the West is doing, the United States, not Europe, what the US is doing is carrying out a grisly experiment. We'll prolong the war, and delay a diplomatic settlement, and we'll experiment. We'll see if maybe Putin will just slink away in total defeat and disappear, or maybe he'll use the weapons that, of course, he has, we all know that, to devastate Ukraine and maybe set the stage for a wider war. And meanwhile, of course, continue on the race to destroy the environment through global heating, make sure that millions of people die from starvation because the Black Sea region can't, which is a major food producer, can't export. But let's try the experiment. It'll be interesting. That's US policy. In fact, it's official. Take a look at it. Take a look at the meeting that just took place at the Ramstein Air Base, the US Air Base in Germany, a couple of weeks ago. The US called the NATO powers, a number of others, to meet at the US Air Base and basically gave them the marching orders. It said the goal is to prolong the war, to harm Russia, and to ensure that Russia will never be able to carry out an act of aggression again. Well, that sounds very nice, but until you start to think for maybe 30 seconds. So let's think for 30 seconds. What does it mean to prevent Russia from ever carrying out aggression again? Well, that's familiar. That's the Versailles Treaty. It was to ensure that Germany would not carry out aggression again. Didn't work too well. A couple of years later, we know what happened. So therefore, what the US is saying is we have to do something harsher than the Versailles Treaty. We have to basically destroy Russia. Maybe something like the Morgenthau Plan for Germany, which was abandoned. Meanwhile, Putin just sits and watches. The other Russian leaders just sit and watch and say, gee, that's a nice idea. This is our leaders. They are clinically insane. Clinically insane. More accurately, they just don't give a damn. As long as you can maintain US domination, who cares? So if the world gets destroyed, that's somebody else's problem. And you even find scholars, so-called scholars. Just recently read one by Timothy Snyder saying, you can't give Russia any off-ramps. Don't give them any escape from this. We got to fight until Russia's basically finished. And don't worry about it. I assure you that it'll be fine because Putin doesn't care about the real world. He just cares about an imaginary world which he can construct. So if he's totally defeated, he'll just invent some story in which it looks like a victory. So we don't have to worry about the Russians responding. This is what we're hearing from respected scholarship. We're living in a madhouse.
So you spoke about US domination, and I know you've spoken a lot about UN reform, issues of the Permanent Five, the veto power. What do you think of the recent amendment or the reform where permanent members that use the veto power will now have to explain their vote to the GA? Do you think that will have any impact?
The United Nations was set up by the major powers, the victors in World War II, to ensure that nothing would interfere with their power. It's primarily the initiative was the United States. In 1945, the overwhelmingly powerful state in the world. Nobody was even close, and remains pretty much true. But they insisted on the veto power so that there would be no interference with them. In fact, if you look at other US positions at the same time, pretty much the same. So World Court jurisdiction was framed by the United States, which was with what was called the Connolly Amendment, senator who said, we accept jurisdiction, but it'll have to be at the, with only insofar as it's beneficial to the United States, basically what it said. And in fact, when the World Court ruled against the United States, charged the United States with unlawful use of force in Reagan's war against Nicaragua, the US just dismissed it. Okay, that's what you guys say. We don't care. In fact, resolution was went to the Security Council, simply calling on states to observe international law, not mentioning anyone, but everyone knew who was intended. The US vetoed it. Veto power. If you look at the Security Council vetoes, overwhelmingly the United States. Russia, China veto it when it's not in their interest. So the United Nations can act insofar as the great powers allow, not beyond. Actually, there are things the UN could do, but they don't want to step on the toes of the great powers.
Speaking of great power rivalry, I know you've spoken a lot about US-China relations. Just curious for your opinion in regards to what are the key factors responsible for the increasing tensions between two countries, and do you see a new Cold War between these two powers?
Well, as you've seen in the last few days, Secretary of State Blinken, Antony Blinken, affirmed, restated in clear terms what US policy is. He said, China is an intolerable threat. It threatens US dominance in East Asia. That's right, it does. It threatens US dominance in Asia. And that can't be tolerated. Then he went on to talk about Chinese aggression, which has to be countered. Well, take a look at his examples of Chinese aggression. The main example is that China is pouring money into developing advanced technology which might surpass the United States. That's Chinese aggression. It's also carrying out harsh repression within China. It's ugly, should be condemned. It's not aggression. But in order to counter this Chinese aggression, the United States has to follow the policy of what's called encircling China, the official name. Encircling China means setting up a ring of so-called sentinel states, South Korea, Japan, Australia, which will be heavily armed with advanced weapons aimed at China. The Biden administration recently extended it to precision weapons, precision-guided weapons, all aimed at China. They're backed by a fleet of nuclear submarines. One US nuclear submarine can destroy almost 200 cities anywhere in the world with its Trident missiles, but that's not enough. So they're being replaced by more advanced submarines, which can maybe kill 400 cities. They have a fleet of them, has to surround China. Australia has to be brought in. The AUKUS deal, kicking France in the face, saying, we rescind our agreement with you. We get nuclear submarines from the United States and its British vassal, which will lead us to completely dominate anything off the waters of China. In fact, they're advertised publicly as being able to sink the Chinese fleet in 72 hours to get into a Chinese port without being detected. But it's all for peace. It's all because we're so peace-loving. We have to prevent aggression. But as Blinken said, the crucial issue is US dominance in the Asian region. We can't sacrifice that. The world has to be ruled by the United States. That's official policy. We have to dominate. And it's perfectly correct because we're so benign and lovely and we never do anything wrong, so you can trust us. It's not a novelty in world affairs. You look at the time, look at our predecessor in world control, Britain. When Britain was ruling the waves, same story. We are noble, we are wonderful, we're an angelic power. We just work for the benefit of everyone. So just trust us and everything will be fine. This is a universal. The US is following the traditional rules, except this time the stakes are a lot higher. If we continue to do that, we'll all be dead.
Do you think China would ever take the US as the world's top power?
I think there's been a lot of talk about that for the last 20 years or so. And my own view is it's total nonsense. China is way behind the United States and by just about every measure. People talk about purchasing power parity, but add the per capita element to it. In GDP, purchasing power parity, China's way behind the United States per capita. Furthermore, militarily, it's not even close. US spending is greater than maybe the next 10 highest military expenditures. And China, of course, has very serious internal problems, demographic, ecological. China has enemies on all sides. The United States has none. It's an extreme imbalance. Now, this nevertheless may happen. The reason is because the United States is destroying itself from within. You can read the headlines every day. Okay. A couple of days ago, another massacre in a school. Can't do anything about it. This has to be, everybody has to have an arsenal full of assault rifles to protect ourselves. Meanwhile, slaughtering children, killing everyone else, homicide, suicide rate is way beyond any other country with guns. In fact, this is the only country where mortality is increasing among the white middle working class people in the 25 to 50-year-old age range. White, the mortality is increasing. Is that happening anywhere else? It's not a decline in the birth rate. They're dying from opioids, overdoses, suicides, and so on. The country is destroying itself from within, and that may lead to a situation in which China is the world dominant power.
Thank you for that. And we'll just move into some questions submitted in by our listeners. The first one is from Daniel. He asks, you have written on the easiness with which people subordinate themselves to government and other powers. An answer they give is enforced or manufactured consent. In recent years, we have seen countless examples of people swaying from traditional political powers, spread and uptake of conspiracy, quote, fake news, freedom protests, climate protests, etc., etc. Are people becoming less subordinate? Is consent harder to manufacture?
That was a quote from my favorite philosopher, David Hume, in what amounts can regard as the first major work of what is now called political science. That's called First Principles of Government, 350 years ago. He opens by saying that he's amazed by the easiness with which the many subordinate themselves to the few. And he concludes that this miracle can happen only by imposing consent. Somehow the masters, the rich and the powerful, can impose consent on the masses who actually have the power to govern if they realize it. Well, go back to the First World War, a crucial moment in the development of these concepts. In the United States, as in every country that was at war, carried out a major propaganda campaign to convince their own citizens that their cause was noble and just. The United States as well, when the US entered the war, 1917, it established the country's first major propaganda agency. It's called the Committee on Public Information. It's an Orwellian term. When you hear states talk about information, they mean disinformation. So this was the Committee on Public Disinformation, which had the task of converting a pacifist population, which didn't want any war, into raving anti-German maniacs. And it worked. And a number of the members of the commission were very impressed. Two of them became very influential. One was Walter Lippmann, became the leading public intellectual of the 20th century. The other was Edward Bernays, who became a founder of the public relations industry, which is in fact the world's largest propaganda agency. Both were liberals, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberals. They concluded, they said, we have learned a lesson from this. It is easy to manufacture consent, that's Lippmann, to engineer consent, that's Bernays. We now have what they called a new art in the practice of democracy. We have a way of ensuring that I'm quoting, the stupid and ignorant masses will not get involved in something which is not their business, public policy. That has to be kept to the smart guys, us, and we have to be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd, the population. And now we've learned how to do it with techniques of manufacture of consent. Well, these have become huge industries, particularly in the more free societies. In the more brutal, harsh societies, it's not that important. You can beat people over the head and send them to prison. But in our societies like ours, it has to be more sophisticated. You have to do it in other ways. And it has been turned into a major art. We see it now very easily. So, for example, the kinds of things I was just talking about, although they're perfectly public, cannot appear in any US media, even official US documents, like Biden's proposal last September to extend the programs of integrating Ukraine into the NATO military command with more military training, more armaments, joint military exercises, part of an enhanced program, as it was called, for NATO membership. Can't report that in the United States. Try to find a word. The Russians, of course, know it. They can read the White House webpage, even if the press can't, and they see it happening. State Department in March, after the invasion, stated that the US does not take into account any Russian security concerns. Well, barely a word about that in the United States, but the Russians surely know. It says no negotiations, okay? We don't take into account your security concerns. It's virtually an invitation to war. Doesn't justify the war, but it's important if you want to understand something about it.
Yeah.
Can't say that. Actually, I did some small experiments just to illustrate the degree of the thought control. It's required in the United States now, if you want to be a serious person, that when you talk about the war in Ukraine, you have to call it the unprovoked war in Ukraine. So if you Google that phrase, you'll get about 1 million hits because everybody uses it. Well, I did a little experiment. I looked up unprovoked war in Iraq, unprovoked invasion of Iraq. Basically nothing. A couple of people who opposed the war and wrote a letter to the editor, but not a single phrase in the mainstream. Well, that's interesting enough in itself, but it becomes more interesting when you look at the facts. The invasion of Iraq was totally unprovoked, not a hint of provocation. The war in Ukraine was criminal aggression, but it was certainly provoked. Just given partial example of that. But you have to, 100% of educated people have to say the opposite. That's pretty good propaganda. And it's just an illustration of what you can see happening all over. In fact, the tightening of censorship in the United States has been really interesting to watch. If you look at US media, you cannot find what the Russians are saying. You want to find out what Foreign Minister Lavrov is saying? Maybe you can go to Indian state TV or the Arab press, they report it. But Americans are not allowed to hear it. I mean, this is, again, this is just insanity. You don't want to hear what the enemy is saying. You got to be so tight in the propaganda that you can't hear it. It's pretty extreme.
Yeah, some really interesting points. And you actually touch and pretty much answer another question in regards to the coverage of different conflicts, especially comparing Iraq to Ukraine. The next question we had was, you have spoken in the past about it being likely that be an apocalypse that is due to, quote, strategic mistake and miscalculation rather than deliberate strike. On this note, history has shown us, whether it be through Cuba, North Korea, or Russia, that we are being close to nuclear warfare, yet never happened. Does the theory of mutually assured destruction guarantee the fact that there'll be no nuclear warfare in the future?
Well, you want to take a chance? It's your business. Actually, if you look at the cases, miscalculation alone came within minutes of causing total nuclear war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, US destroyers were bombing Russian submarines to try to enforce Kennedy's quarantine. The Russian submarines were old-fashioned submarines designed for the North Sea. They could barely function in the tropical waters. They had lost contact with central control in Moscow. They were being attacked with depth charges. They assumed that a war had broken out. They were equipped with torpedoes, with nuclear warheads. The rules of procedure are that 3 officers have to authorize the sending off of a nuclear tipped torpedo. 2 authorized it. The third, Vladimir Arkhipov, decided not to. Vasily Arkhipov decided not to. That's why we're alive. It's happened again several times. There was a time when Defense Secretary William Perry was on the phone, ready to call President Carter to tell him to launch a retaliatory strike, when he got a notice from Central Command that there had been an error. They had played an old tape, which was a which was a training tape by mistake, but it was not a real tape. So he canceled the call. It goes on like this. You feel confident with that game? Okay. I think this is quite apart from the reckless acts which brought the world close to nuclear war. It's a miracle. If you look at the record, it's a miracle that we've survived. And it's not very wise to take a chance on miracles perpetuating themselves.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, for your generous with your time. We know you have a busy schedule, and thank you for answering my questions. Thank you for answering our submitted listeners' questions. And this was a very educational experience and enlightening experience. We appreciate your contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.